the whole discussion or distinction between textual criticism and canon. That's an interesting thing. I haven't heard too much discussion surrounding that. Like, at what level would something be a canonical choice versus something that would be a textual critical choice? You mentioned that these passages were a little bit bigger. So Mark 16, 9 through 20, and the pericope adultery. What deems those canon as opposed to just being a textual critical decision?
In my opinion, and I have not heard a lot of people make this distinction either, so I'd be interested to hear other theologians weigh in on something like this. But in my opinion, when you are shuffling and altering the entire structure of a book, that rises to the level of a canonical modification. We're not here simply talking about which word Paul used or which tense this is or what the order of words are here. We're talking about an entire section of a book. In Mark's case, the longer ending is the conclusion of the book. And in John's case, if you excise this particular section, you have to reshuffle and reconfigure the entire book. For me, that's problematic. Now, I definitely see value to consulting some of the, like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus and Codex Bezae. I think they're all very valuable.
Yeah.
But I don't know that they should have the weight to be able to manipulate our canonical books in these kind of substructural ways by actually removing large sections of text. Now, when it comes to other texts like the comma in 1 John, there I'm definitely going to show my critical text hand, because I just don't think that particular text has the manuscript data behind it. I mean, here we're now shifting from a majority inclusion position, such as with Mark's ending and with the section in John, to a radically minority position within manuscript tradition, such that we can't even really find it in the first 1,000 years. And so for me, Dwayne, we've talked a little bit about this offline, and how we balance antiquity versus majority. For me, much of this entire discussion comes down to how we weigh those two things. I would, in an ideal world, if this were possible, I would certainly be looking for a majority text reading if we could narrow that scope down to the first 1,000 years of Christian manuscript tradition. Because if the manuscripts kind of are the shape of a funnel, right, with the fewest, the earliest, and the more later on as we go, the top of the cone there becomes less relevant to me in terms of its sheer mass of majority voluminousness. But it has to be balanced by antiquity. And so I would say, like, if we could cap, let's say, at 1000 AD and then go with a sheer, pure majority reading, I would think that'd be the best way to do textual criticism.
See, I would think I would push back on that just a little bit. So you if you've watched my channel, I've called myself a Byzantine guy. And so what happens is, if we take the majority of the first 1,000 years, we're going to end up with a majority that probably very likely mostly reflects the papyri, very likely, because the minuscules didn't start coming around till about 900, between 900 and 1,000. That's when they started.
That's the shift,
Byzantine
right?
Text, yeah. So what happens is in the Byzantine Empire, you've got nothing. You've got very, very little for the first couple hundred years. And of course, the reason is because the climate and manuscripts, they degrade and all that sort of thing. They would have been used in the East, used in the Byzantine Empire a little bit more. So they degrade out. So you would have this whole section. And this is, in my opinion, sort of the argument for the Byzantine. But the whole idea is we really don't have a good representative of what the Byzantine text type would have been in the early centuries. So when we say, let's take a majority of everything before 1,000 years, we've kind of tipped the bucket to the Egyptian papyri.
I don't think so. And I'll tell you why, because first of all, if the Byzantine priority text position is correct, then those later Byzantine manuscripts all rest on ancestor text at some point along the line of transmission, right? So one of the things that Maurice Robinson suggests is that there was a scribal process when a text was recopied into the minuscule. He suggests that they destroyed the uncial or the majuscule text that lies underneath it. So supposing that we cut off the end cap of, let's say, 1,000 into the era of the Reformation, I don't think we're destroying the Byzantine text tradition at all. I think it would be preserved, but perhaps in other extant manuscripts that may not have been replaced by the scribes as they go. But what we would be cutting off, and I think this would be helpful, is some of those very, very late anomalous readings that have no lineal succession down to antiquity. And so for a text like the comma of John, where we can't find it in the Greek prior to like 1300, and the only other one is like 1500, that's just like way too late to make it into the tradition from my perspective. And so that would only cut off those most spurious readings. But I think 1,000 years is plenty of time for the stream to mature, for the stream to fully develop and be embodied geographically and otherwise. I think it'd be a fantastic way to do a Greek text.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting, and it'd be really good at measuring how much, what the differentiation between that and the critical text is, right? Because one of my big, I don't want to say beefs, that's kind of too much of a word, but one of the things that I question about the critical text is, do the principles of modern textual criticism work? And is there any testing that shows that the principles we use are doing what they were intended to do? I mean, that's a question in my mind. I don't know if you have any thoughts toward that. Again, we didn't cover this in the questions sent beforehand, but
I think they generally work. One area that I don't think that they work is, and this is where I would agree more with Maurice Robinson's position on majority text readings. I think that the discovery of the first four, your Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, Byzi, I think they have tipped too heavily in their favor, so that while they're no doubt in my mind, Dwayne, they're like ancient wonders of the world. I mean, with Sinaiticus, you've got an extremely early, essentially complete New Testament with much of the Septuagint as well. Same thing for Vaticanus, although we don't have the entirety of the New Testament there. There's some books missing, but these things are absolute treasures. And if you haven't looked at them with your own eyes, you should take some time scoping them out. I mean, apologetically, in terms of defending the Christian faith, what we've been saying against all accusers of the Christian faith is that our faith is ancient and that it is highly supported by the early manuscripts. That the time between the autographs and the manuscripts is not a large gap. Like, that's a pretty important apologetic for us.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
you look at other ancient works like the Iliad and writings of Aristotle and Plato and things, and you've got these multi-hundred year gaps, talking 300, 500, 800 years between editions. But apologetically, we can say, no, Christianity can trace its manuscript lineal tradition back through the earliest centuries. And so I say to my TR brothers out there, man, don't throw out these texts. They're wonderful, glorious testimonies to early Christianity. However, and now I'll sound like a TR guy for a moment, I don't think that we should reshift the entirety of the Greek New Testament just to accommodate the wonderful discoveries of how magnificent these texts are. And I think that's where Westcott and Hort went astray.
Right.
They were super pumped about the discovery of these things, and they're like, man, we got to shift everything. And no, we don't have to shift everything. We have the preponderant of the Byzantine textual tradition. That should be the ballast in the ship, right? In a ship, there's ballast, which keeps the thing afloat, but it also keeps it balanced. The Byzantine text is like the ballast, which keeps us afloat. But these other things have great apologetic value. And I do think that they could be very, very useful to giving us readings in the earliest centuries where the Byzantine text doesn't quite run back quite that far.
Right. So you mentioned now Maurice Robinson twice now. I would love to get him on the channel to talk about his text. Maybe one day we'll see. But you mentioned Maurice Robinson and some of the work he did and how it sort of shaped your view. So between him and Dr. Riddle's response, I'm putting the two in the same boat here. I hope nobody gets upset there. But what was it? I think in your video about Mark 16, you just talked about their response, or Dr. Riddle's response. And you talked about Maurice Robinson and how some of their writings or responses have sort of shifted the way you're thinking about things. What was it about those people, or what was it about their contributions that made you shift your thinking a little bit?
I'm very thankful for Dr. Riddle's long rebuttal to my 16-minute video. I think he spent 2 hours exegeting my 16-minute video. So thank you very much for doing that. He did point out a number of wonderful things to me. And I don't want this reply to him to necessarily be seen as a stick in the eye. And I certainly don't want to accumulate for myself internet rivals where we go back and forth.
Yeah, of course.
So the most of what I learned from Riddle was very, very helpful. For instance, after watching Jeff Riddle, that is when I went back and I read through Maurice Robinson. And so I'm thankful for that introduction. It was probably overdue for me to read that. But, when you're preaching on a regular basis, got all kinds of responsibilities at home and at church. And really, I'm a Jonathan Edwards scholar. I'm not a New Testament manuscript expert. And so I'm kind of even talking out of my field here a little bit. I'm really an Edwards guy. That's what I am. But so I read Maurice Robinson, and I would say, Dwayne, that my value for the Byzantine text went like that as I read him. He made a lot of arguments that I had not thought of before. And so I can credit Jeff Riddle for kind of pushing me in that direction to consider these things. Not only that, but I actually started reading the TR. So that's an improvement from Riddle's position, I imagine. So some of my viewers know I've been reading through the Greek New Testament devotionally now for more than a year. I'm in Revelation 11 as of this morning. And I had been reading from my my UBS 4, which is my favorite. But now, thanks to Riddle, I'm actually reading 3 New Testament Greek texts every morning now. My devotions are getting really long here, Dwayne. But I'm reading from the UBS 4, and then I'm reading from my Tyndale House Greek New Testament, some days, not every day. And now I'm also reading the TR as well. And it's been a wonderful devotional experience for me to do that. Riddle made a few other points that I tend to agree with and that were helpful to me. However, on the other side of that coin, there are some areas, though, that we would have some disagreement still remaining. 2 things in particular. The first is that I cannot figure out, nor can I wrap my mind around what the rules are for the TR only position. And what I mean by that is it seems like the TR defends the TR fundamentally, and that is itself the primary rule. So for instance, most TR advocates, or many of them, will say the reason why we receive the TR as such is because it is the majority text. Okay, fair enough point. For me, that's a pretty weighty consideration. But what if it's not the majority text? Then what rules do we default to? In the case of some texts, they'll point us back to the church fathers, for instance. One thing that I found very interesting in Jeff Riddle, he mentioned the Lord's Prayer, and that the Didache, the very, very early Christian document, the teaching, the Didache, has the longer ending to the Lord's Prayer, which the critical text and the ESV relegate to the footnotes. And so he suggests, well, see, there it is in a very early document. And I'm like, whoa, okay, cool. Glad I learned that.
Right.
Because I love to say the longer ending to the Lord's Prayer, and it's in the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is the the doctrinal standards that we subscribe to. But so how exactly then do these rules work, and how do they work for a text like the comma in John? Because there, it seems to bend all the rules. How does it get in there? It's only in a couple of Greek manuscripts, and they're very, very late. So it's certainly not a majority reading. And even some of the apostolic fathers that it seems to be quoted in, if you actually look up some of those quotations, they're very, very loose. And then you have to wonder whether it's a chicken or the egg thing. Did it get into those very, very late manuscripts because they look like quotations from early church fathers? Or are we weighing the Latin Vulgate more highly than it ought to? And so when it comes to the TR, I'd simply like to know, what are the rules of the game? Because it seems to me like we have the circular argument that the TR defends the TR because it is the TR. And at the end of the day, it's just like, I don't know what we're doing here.
I think that's a little bit of a mischaracterization, right, of Dr. Riddle's position. So so I've had him on the channel twice now to talk about this, because I've only recently, relatively, I think it's been about a year, maybe a little longer now, where I've heard of confessional bibliology. So he would label himself as a confessional bibliologist or a traditional text adherent or something like that. And I think their biggest drivers for maintaining the TR tradition is that, one, it was used in the Protestant Reformation. And of course, we all know the Protestant Reformation was big on coming back to the Bible as the sole source of authority for the church. And then the classic Protestant printed editions. And in the last video, I think I just recently released that, he had labeled those as the editions of Stephanus and Beza and kind of sort of Elsevier, because it came after the main English translations were done. And then the second bit of that, aside from it just being a Protestant Reformation, is in the name Confessional Bibliology. And he would argue that the Westminster Confession of Faith points to the Textus Receptus, and then he uses John Owen to help bring that conclusion to the surface. So I don't think there's necessarily any rules to the game per se, and I'm still a little bit unclear as to how certain TR readings are, but of course that's a video discussion for another day. But I don't think their basis is so much evidential as it is theological.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
can I address that, because that's actually the other area that I wanted to mention in disagreeing with Jeff Riddle. So Jeff is a Baptist who, as far as I understand, subscribes to the Baptist 1689 confession, which is very similar to our Westminster Confession of Faith as Presbyterians. The latter, of course, being chronologically prior to the former, right? So the Westminster Confession of Faith, written 1647, the 1689 Baptist Confession is a modification of Westminster. Okay, no problem so far. What I challenge about the confessional bibliology position is the claim that that is the confessional interpretation of Westminster chapter 1, paragraph 8.
Right.
Because Riddle and others would have us to believe that the section on preservation is a statement on which Greek New Testament text we ought to subscribe to, when in fact that entire controversy is anachronistic to the writing of the Westminster Confession of Faith. So if my interpretation of Westminster 1:8 is that I'm supposed to choose the TR over the critical text, that cannot be. It cannot be what the original Westminster Assembly had in mind when they wrote that particular document, because that entire argument is going to come generations, decades, and indeed centuries after that. So it is certain that the Westminster Divines did not mean the TR to be the received Greek New Testament in opposition to the critical text, because there would be no critical text for centuries to come. So when confessional bibliologists make this claim and root it in the great high orthodox confessions of faith, I don't take that as being a good interpretation of the confessions. The confessions, like every other document that's going to be read fairly, has to be interpreted in its own setting with its own author's intent. And the authors are not intending here to make a statement on which Greek New Testament we are to receive as authoritative. So I find the entire thing to be anachronistic.